on now. Thanks, Tarun. Thanks so much. We'll move on now to the
Thanks.
next our next talk, which is by Dr. Anthony Gaston, who has been studying birds in India from the 1960s and has been coming back regularly. And I think he has an extremely long-term perspective on bird monitoring and changes in birds and bird communities in the country. So Tony will be talking about birds in the Himachal Hills, tracking a century of changes. So if we can have Tony's talk now, and then we'll have questions for him.
Greetings from Ottawa. Hope everybody's doing fine in India. My name's Tony Gaston, and I'm going to be talking about some changes in the avifauna of Himachal over the last century or so. I think everybody knows where Himachal is, but I'm talking mainly about Western Himachal, so areas north and west of Shimla. And on this map, you can see the yellow dots are the points where I've done surveys over the past 50 or so years. The orange line is roughly the distribution of temperate forest, which is the kind of habitat which I've mainly worked in over that period. And then Kangra district is shown in red because that's where Hugh Whistler, a very careful observer, worked in the 1920s. He spent 3 years living in Dharamsala and covered the whole of Kangra district. And he wrote a very detailed paper in the IBIS about the birds of Kangra. So I'm going to be really using 3 time periods: Whistler's observations in the 1920s, my own observations, especially in the 80s and 90s, and then the recent eBird records that mostly are post 2010. So I'll talk first about the Great Himalayan National Park, which is an area where I've done a lot of birding, and a lot of people have done a lot of birding. With Sanjeeva Pandey, I wrote a book about the park a couple of years ago, and we have an appendix in there listing 188 species that we know have occurred in the park. There are a lot more species listed on eBird for the park, but many of those are clearly not seen in the park, but must have been seen on the way in or on the way out. However, I can make fairly accurate comparisons with the list provided by Paul Elson, who is an American graduate student working in Great Himalayan National Park between 2012 and 2015. From the list of birds that we had before his research, there were 18 species that he did not record, of which 9 were considered resident previously. And I'll mention particularly missel thrush, a bird that was fairly common in the 80s and 90s, but which Paul didn't see at all in 2012 to 2015, seems to have disappeared. Conversely, Paul saw 10 potentially resident species which we had not recorded earlier, including grey-headed woodpecker, which is presently fairly common around Great Himalayan National Park, so seems to have moved into the area in recent years. Overall, no evidence for any dramatic change. Now, when we go to look at Whistler's records compared to more recent records, there's lots of evidence for fairly dramatic changes. Firstly, with large birds of prey, I've listed a number of them here, but I'll mention particularly short-toed eagle, which Whistler calls resident, not uncommon. There are currently only 7 eBird records to the west of Shimla in Himachal, so clearly down. The 2 fish eagles, grey-headed and Pallas, both Whistler considered resident in small numbers. Currently, there are only 2 records for grey-headed in Himachal on eBird and 3 records for Pallas's. So it looks as though the fish eagles have really gone down. Turning to the snipe-like birds, solitary snipe, Whistler has seen in small numbers in winter. I had 4 records in the 80s and 90s. Other than that, there's only 1 record on eBird for Himachal, and that was in 1923. The Eurasian woodcock, Whistler says that he shot 20 in winter. He thought it was mainly a winter visitor. I had 7 records from 78 to 91. Currently, there are 15 records on eBird, apart from mine, but all except 2 of those are in Great Himalayan National Park or nearby. So it seems that this species has become very local. Finally, the nightjars. There are 3 species that Whistler recorded in Kangra district. Indian nightjar, he only had 3 records. I had 5 records in the 80s, and currently there's only 1 record to the west of Shimla. Long-tailed nightjar, Whistler calls very common. There are only 10 records to the west of Shimla currently. And Savannah nightjar, Whistler calls exceedingly common, and there are only 6 records now for the whole of Himachal. So it really seems that the nightjars have gone down quite steeply. There are some species that don't seem to have changed. Among the large raptors, Himalayan griffin, black eagle, booted eagle, crested serpent eagle. All of these, when you look at the eBird records, it seems that the status is very similar to what Whistler describes. So the take-home message from all this is birds seem to be doing fine in protected areas such as Great Himalayan National Park and adjacent sanctuaries and reserved forests. There are a number of species, especially large birds of prey, snipes and nightjars, that seem to have decreased since the 1920s, certainly in western Himachal anyway. And I'd like to thank all kinds of people who've helped me over the years. These are just the more prominent. And thank you very much for listening.
Okay, great. We're live again now. Tony, are you there? And if you are, could you switch on your video and microphone?
All kinds of people who've helped me over the years. These are just the more prominent.
Tony, you'll have to mute the YouTube stream. Yes. Okay. There we are. Well, firstly, thank you, Tony, for joining us. It's very late, late at night for you, last night. Again now. But it's really nice to have you here. Let me take a look at the thread here. Kulbhushan asks a question for you, Tony. What do you think are the most pressing ornithological questions that need to be studied in Great Himalayan National Park?
Great Himalayan National Park, I think that we have probably a better idea of the ornithology of Great Himalayan National Park than anywhere else in Himachal. So I would say that we really should be putting our attention into other areas now. I think it's been really well covered, and it's great that there has been so much work, but I would recommend looking elsewhere now.
Okay. Do you have any particular locations in mind?
Yes. Well, I think all of Western Himachal is, much less ornithologized than the Kulu Valley area. That gets a lot of attention, but the upper part of the Ravi Valley particularly would be very interesting. I think there's very few records on eBird.
Okay, thank you. So for your talk, there's a flurry of questions, really interesting and some detailed questions. So let's see how far we can get. And again, my apologies for those who are asking questions. I have to pick and choose. Vijay asks, do you think your results about decline might be attributable to fluctuations, demographic fluctuations, rather than broader environmental changes in one direction? And a related question from Ghazala is, the observations of yours and Paul Elson's in the same season to be able to make these sorts of comparisons?
Oh, the observations, all 3 sets of observations were made year round. So we have winter, spring, summer, winter, and fall. So it's not a seasonal thing. No, I don't think that the changes that we can see between the recent records and Whistler's records can be attributed to just population fluctuations, because my own studies and those of people associated with me went on for quite a few years. So I think we are looking at real changes in population. Having said that, I mean, most people go to the hills in the summer. Wintering birds may not be as well known.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And perhaps a quick response to this question, because we're running out of time, Tony. But Pratik asks, what about the vultures in 2007 and 10? He remembers mostly Himalayan griffon. But any idea about how vultures are faring?
Well, Lammergeier is fine as well. I mean, the high altitude vultures seem to do well, and I presume that's because diclofenac is not used by the sheep, by the shepherds. They're probably mainly feeding on sheep carrion.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Tony. We'll have to draw that to a close, but there are further questions. So if you, when you wake up tomorrow morning, if you can respond to those on Slack, that would be really very nice. Thank you so much for joining us and for staying up, and let's carry the discussion forward. Thank you.